There was one weapon that struck fear into the hearts of German soldiers like no other. It wasn't a tank, it wasn't artillery, and it wasn't a fighter plane. It was a machine gun that could tear through armor, shred aircraft, and cut men in half from over a mile away. German troops called it the Devil's Paintbrush. They whispered about it in foxholes, warned each other about its distinctive sound, and learned to dive for cover the moment they heard its heavy staccato bark. This was the Browning M250 caliber machine gun, and by the end of World War II, it had become the most feared American weapon on the battlefield. But what made this particular gun so terrifying? Why did battle-hardened Wehrmacht veterans who had faced Soviet artillery barrages and British tank assaults single out this one weapon as uniquely deadly? In this video, we'll find out exactly why the Germans learned to dread the sound of the M2 and how this remarkable weapon changed the nature of warfare itself. So, without further ado, let's start with the weapon that would haunt German nightmares. The story of the M250 caliber begins long before World War II, in the closing days of the First World War. In 1918, the legendary American firearms designer John Moses Browning was tasked with creating a heavy machine gun capable of penetrating the armor of the new tanks that were beginning to dominate the battlefield. What Browning delivered was a revolutionary design that would still be in service more than a century later. The original M1921 Browning .50 caliber was tested and refined throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, with the definitive M2 model being standardized in 1933. By the time the United States entered World War II in December 1941, the M2 had already proven itself in limited conflicts, but nothing could prepare German forces for the scale and effectiveness with which American troops would deploy this devastating weapon. The M2 fired a cartridge known as the .50 caliber BMG, which stood for Browning Machine Gun. This massive round measured ½ an inch in diameter and over 5 inches in length, weighing nearly 4 ounces. When fired, the bullet left the barrel at speeds approaching 3,000 feet per second, carrying energy levels that dwarfed anything a standard rifle could produce. The kinetic force generated by this enormous projectile was sufficient to penetrate over an inch of hardened steel at close range, and could remain lethal at distances exceeding 2 miles. This combination of power, range, and accuracy made the M2 uniquely versatile, capable of engaging targets from individual soldiers to light armored vehicles and low-flying aircraft. What truly set the M2 apart from other heavy machine guns of the era was its reliability and rate of fire. The weapon cycled at approximately 450 to 600 rounds per minute, depending on the specific variant and how it was employed. This might seem modest compared to the German MG42's blistering 900 to 1200 rounds per minute, but the M2's advantage lay in the devastating power of each individual round. Where the MG42 fired a standard rifle cartridge, the M2 launched projectiles with more than 5 times the kinetic energy. A single .50 caliber round could accomplish what might require 10 or 20 rifle caliber bullets. The weapon's recoil-operated mechanism was remarkably robust, functioning reliably in conditions that would jam lesser weapons. American soldiers used the M2 in blazing desert heat, Arctic cold, tropical humidity, and everything in between. Unlike many weapons that required constant cleaning and maintenance, the M2 could continue firing even when caked with mud, sand, or ice. This legendary reliability meant that when German troops encountered an M2 position, they knew it would keep firing until either the ammunition ran out or the gun crew was killed. There would be no convenient jams or mechanical failures to exploit. The Germans first encountered the M2 in significant numbers during the North African campaign in late 1942. When American forces landed in Operation Torch in November of that year, they brought with them hundreds of M2 machine guns mounted on everything from jeeps to half-tracks to tanks. German and Italian forces, who had been fighting the British for over 2 years, were unprepared for the firepower that American units could bring to bear. The M2's effective range of nearly 2,000 yards meant that American gun crews could engage enemy positions from distances that German infantry weapons couldn't match. Veterans of the Afrika Korps, Rommel's elite desert force, quickly learned that approaching American positions required extreme caution. One German officer, writing in his diary after the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, described the American heavy machine guns as creating walls of steel that were nearly impossible to penetrate. He noted that the sound of the M2 was distinctly different from any other weapon on the battlefield, a heavy, methodical pounding that seemed to announce the presence of overwhelming firepower. What he didn't mention, but what his soldiers certainly experienced, was the psychological effect of seeing those massive 50 caliber rounds impacting around them, throwing up enormous geysers of dirt and rock, and knowing that even a near miss from such a weapon could prove fatal. The physical effects of being hit by a 50 caliber round were truly horrific, and German medical personnel struggled to treat wounds from this weapon. Standard rifle bullets create relatively small wound channels, and many battlefield injuries during World War II, while serious, were survivable with proper medical care. A 50 caliber round was an entirely different matter. The massive projectile didn't just penetrate flesh, it destroyed everything in its path. Soldiers hit in a limb often required immediate amputation, as the hydrostatic shock, and tissue damage extended far beyond the actual bullet path. A torso hit was almost invariably fatal, with the bullet creating exit wounds the size of dinner plates and destroying multiple organs simultaneously. German combat medics soon learned that there was little they could do for soldiers hit by 50 caliber fire. The sheer destructive power of the weapon meant that casualties were usually either lightly wounded by fragments and near misses, or killed outright. There was rarely anything in between. This binary outcome added to the weapon's fearsome reputation, as surviving soldiers could see firsthand what happened to their comrades who were unfortunate enough to be struck directly. One of the most effective applications of the M2 was on vehicles, where it could be mounted with a 360-degree field of fire and supplied with ample ammunition. American Jeeps, officially known as the Willys MB, were often equipped with a pedestal-mounted M2 in the rear, creating a highly mobile weapons platform that could race to threatened positions and deliver devastating firepower. German soldiers quickly learned to target these Jeeps, knowing that a single vehicle-mounted 50 caliber could dominate an entire sector of the battlefield. Half-tracks, the M3 and M16 variants in particular, carried multiple 50 caliber guns and could serve as mobile fortresses. The M16 multiple-gun motor carriage, nicknamed the Meat Chopper, mounted 4 M2 machine guns on a single turret, creating a weapon system that could pour out nearly 2,000 rounds per minute of 50 caliber ammunition. German pilots who encountered these vehicles quickly learned to give them a wide berth, as the combined firepower of 4 M2s was sufficient to shred any low-flying aircraft. Infantry formations were equally wary, as the M16 could sweep an area clear of enemy troops in seconds. American tanks also mounted the M2, typically as a commander's weapon on the turret. The M4 Sherman tank, which formed the backbone of American armored forces, featured a 50 caliber machine gun that gave the tank commander the ability to engage soft targets without expending main gun ammunition. This proved particularly valuable in urban combat, where German infantry often attempted to get close to American tanks to attack them with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. The tank commander could rotate the turret-mounted M2 and engage enemy soldiers at ranges where rifle fire would be ineffective. German veterans of the Italian campaign, particularly the fighting around Monte Cassino in early 1944, reported that American tanks advancing through the rubble used their 50 caliber guns to systematically destroy any potential hiding places for Panzerfaust teams. The psychological effect was considerable, as German infantry knew that they had to get within 50 yards or less to use their anti-tank weapons effectively, but the M2 could kill them at 10 times that distance. This meant that every advance toward an American tank was potentially suicidal, and German casualties among anti-tank teams were extraordinarily high. The M2's versatility extended to aircraft, where it served as the primary armament for American fighters and bombers throughout the war. The standard American fighter by 1943 was the P-51 Mustang, which carried 6 M2 machine guns, 3 in each wing. The P-47 Thunderbolt was even more heavily armed with 850 caliber guns. These aircraft could bring devastating firepower to bear on ground targets, and German troops learned to dread the sight of American fighters diving on their positions. The strafing runs conducted by P-47s and P-51s were terrifying experiences for German soldiers, who had nowhere to hide from the hail of 50 caliber bullets that could penetrate foxholes, light vehicles, and even some fortified positions. One Luftwaffe pilot who was shot down and captured in France in 1944 told his interrogators that German fighter pilots had tremendous respect for the hitting power of American fighters. He explained that while German aircraft often carried heavier cannon armament, the American practice of mounting 6 or 8 M2 machine guns created a cone of fire that was nearly impossible to evade in a dogfight. German fighters could withstand a few hits from 50 caliber ammunition, but the sheer volume of fire from multiple M2s meant that once an American fighter got on your tail, your chances of survival were slim. The training American soldiers received in the employment of the M2 was comprehensive and emphasized the weapon's unique capabilities. Unlike the MG-42, which German doctrine viewed primarily as a defensive weapon used to create zones of suppressive fire, American doctrine treated the M2 as both a defensive and offensive tool. Gun crews were trained to engage targets at extreme ranges, using the M2's accuracy and power to destroy enemy positions before they could effectively return fire. The weapons? Maximum effective range against area targets was listed as over 1,800 yards, and skilled crews could achieve first-round hits on point targets at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. This long-range precision, combined with the devastating effect of each hit, made the M2 an ideal weapon for what modern military theorists call area denial. A single well-positioned M2 could control an enormous sector of battlefield, forcing enemy troops to either find covered routes of advance or accept catastrophic casualties attempting to cross open ground. German tactical manuals from 1944 specifically warned troops about American heavy machine gun positions and recommended using artillery or armor to eliminate them rather than attempting infantry assaults. The ammunition variety available for the M2 added to its versatility and lethality. The standard ball ammunition was effective against most targets, but American forces also employed armor-piercing incendiary rounds which could penetrate armored vehicles and often set them on fire. These API rounds featured a hardened steel core surrounded by an incendiary compound that would ignite on impact, starting fires in fuel tanks and ammunition storage. German vehicles with thin armor, such as half-tracks, armored cars, and some tank destroyers, were particularly vulnerable to this ammunition type. Tracer rounds, loaded every 5th or 6th round in typical belts, allowed gunners to observe their fire and adjust aim, making long-range engagements much more effective. The tracers also had a psychological impact on German troops, as they could watch the streams of glowing projectiles arcing toward their positions and know exactly where the fire was concentrated. Some American units loaded special ammunition belts for anti-aircraft work, with a higher proportion of tracers and API rounds to maximize their effectiveness against aircraft. There was even an armor-piercing capped round for use against heavier armor, though this was less common than the standard API. German soldiers who survived encounters with the M2 consistently reported that the sound of the weapon was one of its most terrifying aspects. The heavy, slower rate of fire compared to the MG-42 created a distinctive cadence that experienced troops could identify immediately. One Wehrmacht veteran interviewed after the war described it as sounding like a sledgehammer striking an anvil, with each impact resonating across the battlefield. Unlike the ripping cloth sound of the MG-42, which fired so rapidly that individual shots blurred together, the M2's measured pace meant that soldiers could hear each individual round, knowing that any one of them could be the one that killed them. The psychological difference was significant. With the MG-42, German troops could fire high volumes of suppressive fire and rely on probability to hit targets. With the M2, American crews were making precision shots, and German soldiers knew that if they were being engaged, the gunner had specifically selected them as a target and was aiming deliberately. This created a different kind of fear, more personal and directed. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 provided German forces with their first large-scale encounter with American M2-equipped units, and the experience was sobering for the Afrika Korps veterans who had previously dismissed American fighting capabilities. General Lieutenant Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, commanding German forces in Tunisia, received numerous reports from his frontline officers about the effectiveness of American heavy machine gun fire. One particularly detailed account came from a company commander in the 21st Panzer Division, who described an attempted assault on an American position near the Kasserine Pass itself. His company had been ordered to clear American forces from a ridge overlooking a critical road junction, and intelligence had suggested that the defenders were relatively green troops who would likely break under determined attack. The reality proved very different. As his infantry advanced across approximately 800 yards of relatively open ground, they came under fire from what he estimated were at least 4 M2 heavy machine guns positioned at different points along the ridge. The initial volleys were fired at extreme range, over 1,200 yards, and while the accuracy at that distance was limited, several of his men were hit by the enormous 50 caliber rounds. The wounds were so catastrophic that his medics could do nothing for the casualties. As his company closed the distance, the American fire became more accurate and more devastating. At 600 yards, the M2 rounds were hitting with enough precision that his platoon leaders began taking casualties. At 400 yards, the fire was murderous, with multiple soldiers being hit with each burst. He called off the attack after losing 37 men killed and another 48 wounded. Many. Seriously, without ever getting close enough to the American positions to effectively return fire with their own weapons. The effectiveness of the M2 in North Africa was enhanced by the terrain, which often consisted of long, open approaches between positions. German forces, accustomed to the confined terrain of the European continent, where engagements often occurred at much shorter ranges, found that their tactical doctrine was poorly suited to the conditions in Tunisia and Libya. The standard German infantry squad carried an MG-34 or MG-42 machine gun, which was excellent for close-range suppression, but lacked the range and power to engage American M2 positions effectively. German commanders quickly realized that they needed to employ indirect fire assets, particularly mortars and artillery, to suppress American heavy machine guns before attempting infantry assaults. However, this requirement created its own problems. Artillery ammunition was always in short supply for Axis forces in North Africa, particularly in the final months of the campaign when Allied naval and air superiority made resupply increasingly difficult. Expending precious artillery shells on machine gun positions meant less fire support was available for other targets. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to have unlimited ammunition for their 50 caliber guns and could afford to engage targets that German forces would have ignored as not worth the expenditure of ammunition. This disparity in resources added to the psychological burden on German troops, who knew that every time they attempted to maneuver, American M2 gunners would be watching, ready to open fire. The air war over North Africa provided another arena where German forces encountered the M2 with devastating results. American heavy bombers, particularly the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, bristled with M2 machine guns. The B-17F model, which entered service in 1942, carried 1350 caliber machine guns positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire in every direction. German fighter pilots, who had previously enjoyed considerable success against British bombers that were often more lightly armed, found that attacking American bomber formations was far more dangerous. The combined firepower of a single B-17 was formidable, but American bombers flew in tight formations specifically designed to concentrate their defensive fire. Attacking a formation of 18 B-17 meant flying into a storm of 50 caliber bullets with over 200 machine guns, all trained on the attacking fighters. Luftwaffe pilots quickly learned that head-on attacks, which reduced the time spent in the defensive fire zone, were the only viable approach, but even these tactics resulted in heavy losses. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, a Luftwaffe ace who flew against American bombers throughout 1943 and 1944, wrote in his combat diary about the sheer volume of tracer fire from American bomber formations. He described it as flying through a spider's web of glowing lines, any one of which could tear your aircraft apart. The psychological stress of these missions was intense, and German fighter pilot casualties mounted steadily as the American bombing campaign intensified. The physical layout of the M2 itself contributed to its effectiveness. The weapon was belt-fed, with ammunition supplied in metallic link belts that could be assembled to any practical length. In fixed defensive positions, American crews sometimes assembled belts containing several hundred rounds, allowing for sustained fire without the need to reload. The weight of the weapon, approximately 84 pounds for the basic gun with an additional 44 pounds for the tripod mount, made it stable and controllable despite the enormous recoil generated by the .50 caliber cartridge. German soldiers who managed to capture M2 weapons during the war and attempted to use them consistently reported that the weapon was superbly engineered and a pleasure to fire despite its weight and power. The controls were intuitive, the weapon's balance was excellent, and the recoil, while substantial, was manageable due to the gun's mass and the efficiency of its recoil-operated mechanism. This stood in stark contrast to some German heavy weapons which were either too complex for easy operation or punishing to use for extended periods. The M2's barrel could be changed relatively quickly when it became overheated from sustained firing, a feature that German weapons like the MG42 also incorporated, but which was less critical given the MG42's lighter ammunition and higher rate of fire. The M2's massive barrel could absorb significant heat before requiring replacement, and the barrel change procedure could be completed by a trained crew in under 2 minutes. This meant that American M2 positions could maintain almost continuous fire during critical moments in a battle, pausing only briefly for barrel changes. German assault troops attacking American positions sometimes reported that they had expected the heavy machine gun fire to slacken as barrels overheated, only to find that after a brief pause, the firing resumed with undiminished intensity. This ability to sustain fire for extended periods made the M2 particularly effective in defensive roles, where American forces could prepare positions with ample ammunition supplies and spare barrels positioned for quick changes. The versatility of the M2's mounting systems allowed it to be employed in virtually any tactical situation. The standard M3 tripod mount provided a stable platform for long-range precision fire and could be emplaced in fixed positions where the gun crew expected to remain for extended periods. The tripod's traverse and elevation mechanisms allowed for precise aiming, and the mount could be fitted with optical sights for engaging targets at maximum range. For mobile operations, the M2 could be mounted on a variety of vehicles using Paintbrush, mounts that allowed for rapid traversing but were less stable than the tripod. Aircraft mounts were specifically designed for each type of aircraft, with sophisticated sighting systems and mechanisms to synchronize the gun's fire through the propeller arc on single-engine fighters. The existence of so many mounting options meant that American forces could employ the M2 effectively in any environment, from the jungles of the Pacific to the frozen fields of Belgium. German forces, by contrast, generally used their heavy weapons in more specialized roles, which meant that they were sometimes caught without the right tool for a particular tactical situation. One aspect of the M2 that German intelligence officers found particularly concerning was the weapon's longevity. Captured American manuals indicated that with proper maintenance, an M2 could fire tens of thousands of rounds before requiring major overhaul or replacement. German weapons of comparable power, such as the 2-centimeter Flak 38 anti-aircraft gun, typically had much shorter service lives before the barrel wore out or the mechanism began to malfunction. This meant that every M2 that arrived in a combat theatre would likely remain in service until it was destroyed in combat or captured by enemy forces. The Germans could not rely on American weapons breaking down or wearing out to reduce the threat they posed. Technical intelligence reports from 1943 noted that captured M2 weapons showed little sign of wear even after obvious heavy use, and that the manufacturing quality was consistently high across different production batches and manufacturers. This was a source of frustration for German ordnance experts who were struggling with declining manufacturing standards as the war progressed, and Germany's industrial capacity came under increasing strain from Allied bombing. The ammunition supply situation for the M2 was another factor that contributed to German fears about the weapon. American industrial capacity was so vast that there was never any shortage of .50 caliber ammunition in any theatre where American forces operated. Gun crews were encouraged to fire freely at any target that presented itself, without worrying about conserving ammunition. German forces, by contrast, were constantly reminded to conserve ammunition and make every shot count. This difference in supply situations meant that American M2 gunners could engage targets that German machine gunners would have been forced to ignore. Suspicious movements in distant tree lines, possible observation posts, vehicles that might or might not be occupied, All of these could be engaged with long-range 50 caliber fire without any concern about wasting ammunition. For German troops, this created an environment where they were never truly safe, even at ranges they considered beyond effective small arms reach. The knowledge that at any moment a stream of 50 caliber bullets might begin impacting around their position, even when they thought they were in a relatively secure rear area, was psychologically exhausting. The combat debut of American airborne forces during the invasion of Sicily in July 1943 showcased yet another application of the M2. Airborne units, despite their need to travel light, recognized the value of the 50 caliber machine gun and made arrangements to have M2s dropped with their heavy equipment. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions both employed M2s during the Sicily campaign, typically mounting them on jeeps that were delivered by glider. German forces on Sicily, many of whom were coastal defense units with limited combat experience, found themselves facing American paratroopers equipped with weapons more powerful than anything their own elite infantry units carried. The psychological impact of this was considerable. German doctrine held that airborne forces, because of their limited heavy weapons, should be vulnerable to counterattack by conventional infantry supported by armor. The presence of M2 heavy machine guns in American airborne units undermined this assumption and forced German commanders to treat even isolated groups of American paratroopers as serious threats requiring carefully planned responses. The Italian campaign, which began in September 1943 with landings at Salerno, saw the M2 employed in some of the most challenging terrain of the war. The mountainous spine of Italy, with its narrow valleys and steep ridges, might have seemed unsuitable for a weapon designed for long-range fire. However, American forces quickly discovered that the M2 was ideal for dominating the valleys from positions on the heights. A single M2 emplaced on a ridge could control movement throughout an entire valley floor, forcing German troops to either advance under fire or spend days attempting to flank the position through even more difficult terrain. The fighting around the Winterline, particularly the battles for Monte Cassino, saw intensive use of M2S in both offensive and defensive roles. American and British Commonwealth forces attacking German positions used M2 fire to suppress enemy strongpoints, while assault teams moved forward. German forces counterattacking against Allied beachheads and salients found that every attack ran into walls of 50 caliber fire that tore apart their formations before they could close with the defenders. German tactical responses to the M2 evolved throughout the war, but none proved entirely satisfactory. Early attempts to neutralize M2 positions with infantry assaults resulted in prohibitive casualties, as we have seen. The preferred method became the use of indirect fire, particularly from mortars and artillery, to destroy or suppress the heavy machine guns before infantry moved forward. However, this required accurate target location and sufficient ammunition, neither of which was always available. American M2 crews became adept at selecting positions that were difficult to pinpoint from a distance and offered good cover from indirect fire. The use of defilade positions where the gun was positioned behind cover that protected it from direct observation made it nearly impossible for German forward observers to direct accurate artillery fire. Mortar fire could sometimes be effective, particularly the 81mm and 120mm mortars that German infantry units employed, but these weapons lacked the range to engage M2 positions that were emplaced at maximum distance from the front lines. The result was that German forces often had to accept that American heavy machine guns would dominate certain sectors of the battlefield and plan their operations accordingly. Some German units attempted to use captured M2 weapons against their former owners, but this practice was less common than the use of captured Soviet or British weapons. The main obstacle was ammunition supply. While German forces could often capture significant quantities of small arms ammunition when they overran American positions, 50 caliber ammunition was much bulkier and harder to transport in useful quantities. A single belt of 50 caliber ammunition weighed several pounds and contained only 110 rounds, which could be expended in less than 15 seconds of sustained fire. German units that attempted to employ captured M2s found that they simply could not maintain them in action for long enough to justify the effort required to incorporate them into their defensive positions. There are documented instances of German forces using captured M2s during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when they overran American positions and captured significant quantities of equipment. However, these weapons were generally used only until the captured ammunition was exhausted, at which point they were abandoned. The Germans did conduct technical evaluations of captured M2s and recognized the weapon's superior engineering and effectiveness, but they lacked the industrial capacity to produce a comparable weapon even if they had wanted to copy the design. The psychological dimension of the M2's effectiveness cannot be overstated. German soldiers who fought on both the Eastern and Western fronts consistently reported that the American heavy machine gun was one of the most feared weapons they encountered. This fear was based not just on the weapon's physical capabilities, but on what it represented. The presence of M2s in large numbers demonstrated American industrial might and the vast resources available to American forces. Every M2 position represented tons of ammunition, sophisticated manufacturing, and the ability to transport heavy equipment to the front lines in quantities that German forces could only dream of. For German soldiers who were fighting with dwindling supplies, obsolete equipment, and the knowledge that their own industrial base was being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing, the sight of American troops lavishly equipped with heavy weapons was deeply demoralizing. It reinforced the growing realization that Germany simply could not match the material superiority of its enemies, and that the war was ultimately unwinnable. This psychological impact was particularly acute in 1944 and 1945, as the quality of German replacements declined and units found themselves facing American forces that seemed to have unlimited supplies of everything from ammunition to hot meals. The M2, visible on nearly every American vehicle and emplaced at every defensive position, became a symbol of this overwhelming material advantage. The D-Day invasion of June 6, 1944, marked the largest amphibious assault in history and provided German defenders with their most intense exposure yet to the overwhelming firepower of American forces. The beaches of Normandy became proving grounds for the M2, as American troops brought hundreds of the heavy machine guns ashore aboard landing craft, vehicles, and specialized armored equipment. German forces defending the Atlantic Wall had prepared elaborate fortifications and were confident that they could repel any invasion attempt through the combination of obstacles, mines, and concentrated defensive fire. What they had not adequately prepared for was the sheer volume of firepower that American forces could deliver in support of the landing troops. Navy vessels offshore mounted multiple M2s for anti-aircraft defense and suppression of shore positions. Landing craft infantry, known as LCIs, carried multiple 50 caliber guns to suppress beach defenses as the craft approached shore. Tanks and half-tracks specially waterproofed for the invasion churned through the surf with their M2s already firing at German positions. The defenders at Omaha Beach, the most heavily contested of the invasion beaches, reported being overwhelmed by the intensity of fire coming from the sea. While much attention has been paid to the naval gunfire support provided by destroyers and battleships, the collective fire of hundreds of M2 machine guns was equally important in suppressing German defensive positions and allowing American troops to gain a foothold on the beach. Obergefreiter Heinrich Sevelow, a German machine gunner who achieved notoriety for the number of American casualties his MG-42 inflicted at Omaha Beach, later recounted his experiences in interviews and written accounts. He described the American firepower as unlike anything he had experienced on the Eastern Front. While Soviet attacks had featured human wave assaults and masses of infantry, the Americans came ashore with what seemed like unlimited quantities of heavy weapons. Sevelow estimated that for every German machine gun firing from the heights above Omaha Beach, there were 10 or more American heavy weapons firing back. The MG-42 he manned was eventually silenced not by infantry assault, but by concentrated fire from multiple sources, including what he identified as 50 caliber machine guns mounted on vehicles that had managed to get off the beach. He noted that the sheer weight of return fire made it nearly impossible to maintain aimed fire for more than a few seconds before having to take cover. This was a new experience for German machine gunners, who were accustomed to being the ones delivering suppressive fire while enemy infantry attempted to advance under its weight. At Normandy, the roles were reversed, with German defenders finding themselves suppressed by American firepower, while American infantry and armour advanced steadily despite their casualties. The Bocage country of Normandy, with its dense hedgerows and small fields, presented unique challenges for both attackers and defenders. German forces initially believed that this terrain favoured the defence, as the hedgerows provided excellent cover and concealment for defensive positions, and made American armour less effective. However, American forces quickly adapted their tactics and discovered that the M2 was ideal for dominating the Bocage. Vehicle-mounted 50 caliber guns could be elevated to fire over hedgerows, suppressing German positions while infantry maneuvered to flank them. The M2's ability to penetrate the earthen banks that supported many hedgerows meant that German soldiers could not simply hide behind cover and wait for American assaults to peter out. 50 caliber rounds would punch through the banks and find soldiers sheltering on the far side, creating a sense of vulnerability that undermined the defensive advantages the terrain should have provided. American units developed tactics that involved using M2 fire to keep German defenders' heads down, while engineers used explosives to blow gaps in hedgerows, allowing tanks and infantry to advance. The Germans found that responding to these tactics required exposing themselves to the devastating 50 caliber fire, and casualties among defenders mounted steadily. The Battle for St. Lo in July 1944 demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms tactics built around the M2's firepower. American forces attacking this critical communications hub employed M2s in every conceivable role. Infantry weapons companies used tripod-mounted M2s to provide long-range suppressive fire against German strongpoints. Armor units used their vehicle-mounted weapons to engage targets that were not worth expending tank rounds on. Anti-aircraft units, finding few Luftwaffe aircraft to engage, turned their quad-mounted M2s against ground targets with devastating effect. The M16 multiple-gun motor carriage proved particularly effective in urban combat, as the 4-gun turret could be rotated to engage targets in any direction without having to reposition the vehicle. German forces defending St. Lo reported that the intensity of American fire made it nearly impossible to reinforce threatened sectors during daylight hours. Any attempt to move troops or supplies forward immediately drew concentrated fire from multiple American weapons, with the distinctive sound of M2S prominent among the various guns engaging the movement. The city fell to American forces on July 18, 1944, after weeks of grinding combat that demonstrated the difficulty German forces faced in holding fixed positions against opponents with such overwhelming firepower advantages. The versatility of the M2 in engaging different target types made it uniquely valuable in the fluid combat of the Normandy campaign. German forces attempting to conduct local counterattacks found that American M2 positions could engage their armor, their infantry, and their supporting weapons all with the same gun. Light German armored vehicles such as the SDKFZ 251 half-track and the SDKFZ 234 armoured car were vulnerable to 50 caliber armour-piercing ammunition at combat ranges. Heavier vehicles like the Panzer IV tank were generally immune to M2 fire, except at very close range where shots might penetrate vision ports or other weak points. But German infantry accompanying the tanks were extremely vulnerable. This meant that German combined arms teams could not operate effectively in areas dominated by American M2 fire. The tanks might survive, but their supporting infantry would be decimated, leaving the armor vulnerable to American bazooka teams and close assault. German commanders were forced to either avoid areas covered by M2 fire or expend precious artillery ammunition to suppress the heavy machine guns before attempting to advance. Neither option was satisfactory, as avoiding strong points simply ceded terrain to American forces, while the expenditure of artillery ammunition reduced the support available for other operations. German armoured forces in Normandy quickly learned to respect the penetration capabilities of American 50 caliber armour-piercing ammunition. While the round could not penetrate the frontal armour of German medium and heavy tanks, it was capable of damaging or destroying various external equipment that tanks needed to operate effectively. Periscopes and vision blocks could be shattered by 50 caliber hits, reducing the crew's ability to observe their surroundings. Radio antennas could be shot off, cutting communications with supporting units and higher command. External fuel tanks, sometimes carried on the rear of German tanks to extend their operational range, could be punctured and ignited by API rounds. Track links and suspension components, while robust, could sometimes be damaged by sustained 50 caliber fire, potentially immobilizing a tank. The psychological effect on tank crews of being under M2 fire was considerable, even when the rounds were not penetrating the armor. The sound of 50 caliber bullets impacting armor plate was distinctive and loud, and crews knew that even though the main armor was holding, other damage might be accumulating that would eventually disable the vehicle or kill exposed crewmen. The employment of M2s in American tank destroyer battalions added another dimension to their effectiveness against German armor. The M10 and M36 tank destroyers, which were the primary American vehicles designed specifically for engaging enemy tanks, both featured an M2 machine gun as secondary armament. This allowed tank destroyer crews to engage German infantry attempting to protect their tanks from the main gun, while keeping the powerful 76mm or 90mm gun available for armor targets. The combination was devastatingly effective. German panzer commanders found that American tank destroyer units could engage their supporting infantry with .50 caliber fire at ranges where the German infantry weapons were ineffective, while simultaneously threatening the tanks themselves with armor-piercing main gun fire. The usual German tactic of using infantry screens to protect armor from enemy tank hunters was far less effective against American tank destroyers than it had been against Soviet or British armor, specifically because of the M2's presence as secondary armament. Moving to the air war, the intensification of American daylight bombing raids over Germany in 1944 brought hundreds of B-17 and B-24 bombers into German airspace daily, each one bristling with M2 machine guns. Luftwaffe fighter pilots faced an increasingly impossible task as American fighter escorts became more numerous and bomber formations grew larger. The defensive firepower of the bomber streams was formidable enough that German fighters could not simply dive through formations and expect to survive, as they might have done earlier in the war. Detailed Luftwaffe loss analysis from mid-1944 showed that a significant percentage of fighter losses over Germany were attributed to bomber defensive fire, with the M2 being the weapon primarily responsible. The .50 caliber rounds combination of range, accuracy, and hitting power meant that German fighters were vulnerable throughout their attack runs, not just in the final seconds before breaking away. Fighter pilots reported that they could see tracer rounds from bomber defensive fire at distances exceeding a kilometer, giving them ample opportunity to watch the storm of fire they were about to fly through. The psychological strain of repeatedly flying into these bomber streams contributed to the declining effectiveness of the Luftwaffe fighter force, as experienced pilots were killed faster than they could be replaced, and new pilots often lasted only a few missions before being shot down. The introduction of American long-range fighter escorts in early 1944 further increased German fighter pilots' exposure to M2 fire. The P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang could now accompany bomber formations deep into German territory, engaging Luftwaffe fighters before they could attack the bombers. Both American fighter types relied exclusively on the M2 for armament, with the P-47 carrying 8 guns and the P-51 carrying 6. German pilots who survived encounters with these aircraft consistently reported that the volume of fire from multiple .50 caliber guns was overwhelming. Unlike German fighters, which typically carried a mix of machine guns and cannon, American fighters could bring all their weapons to bear simultaneously without worrying about different ballistics or rates of fire. This created a cone of fire that was very difficult to evade once an American fighter achieved a firing position. The lethality of 6 or 8 M2s firing in unison was such that a single solid burst lasting perhaps 2 seconds was often sufficient to destroy a German fighter. Luftwaffe training manuals from late 1944 specifically warned pilots to avoid turning fights with American fighters, if at all possible, as the American armament advantage in such engagements was overwhelming. The ground attack role, which American fighters increasingly assumed as the Luftwaffe was driven from the skies, showcased another deadly application of the M2. Fighter bombers like the P-47 could carry bombs or rockets for attacking hardened targets, but their .850 caliber machine guns were devastatingly effective against softer targets like trucks, trains, artillery positions, and troop concentrations. The German retreat from France in August 1944, following the Allied breakout from Normandy, became a nightmare for German forces specifically because of American air supremacy and the effectiveness of fighter-bomber attacks. Thousands of German vehicles were destroyed by American fighters strafing the roads and highways leading back to Germany. The P-47, with its rugged construction and powerful armament, could dive on a column of vehicles, fire several hundred rounds of .50 caliber ammunition while pulling up, and leave behind a trail of burning trucks and dead soldiers. German troops learned that any movement during daylight hours was likely to attract air attack, and the psychological effect of being unable to move freely because of the constant threat from above was deeply demoralizing. Veterans of the Falaise Pocket, where tens of thousands of German troops were trapped by Allied forces and subjected to continuous air attack, described the experience as apocalyptic, with American fighters making repeated strafing runs that destroyed everything that moved. The technical comparison between the M2 and its German counterparts is instructive in understanding why German soldiers feared the American weapons so much. The closest German equivalent in terms of role and application was probably the 2-centimeter Flak 38 anti-aircraft gun, which fired a 20mm round and could be employed against both air and ground targets. However, the Flak 38 was a larger, heavier weapon that was not nearly as versatile as the M2. It could not be easily mounted on vehicles the way the M2 could, its rate of fire was lower, and its ammunition was less effective against armoured targets. The MG42, while an excellent weapon in its own right, fired a standard 7.92mm rifle round that simply lacked the power and range of the 50 caliber cartridge. A direct comparison of the two weapons highlights the M2's advantages. The MG42's maximum effective range was approximately 1,200 meters against area targets, while the M2 could engage effectively at over 1,800 meters. The MG42's projectile carried approximately 3,300 joules of kinetic energy at the muzzle, while the M2's 50 caliber round delivered over 18,000 joules. This meant that the M2 hit with more than 5 times the force of the MG42. And this energy differential only increased at longer ranges where the lighter German round lost velocity more quickly. The ammunition weight difference also played a role in the weapon's respective effectiveness. 1,000 rounds of 7.92mm ammunition for the MG42 weighed approximately 26 kilograms, while 1,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition weighed approximately 130 kilograms. This meant that German infantry squads could carry much more ammunition for their machine guns than American crews could for the M2. However, this advantage was largely negated by the M2's much greater effect per round. A single 50 caliber hit could accomplish what might require 10 or 20 hits from a rifle caliber weapon, meaning that the effective ammunition load, measured in killing power rather than number of rounds, was actually quite similar. Moreover, American logistical superiority meant that M2 crews rarely faced ammunition shortages, while German infantry increasingly struggled to maintain adequate supplies of all types of ammunition as the war progressed. The result was that, in practical terms, American M2 gunners could engage more targets more often and with greater effect than their German counterparts with the MG42. Urban combat operations revealed yet another dimension of the M2's effectiveness. The fighting in cities like Aachen, which was the first major German city captured by American forces in October 1944, saw intensive use of M2s in roles that the weapon had not been specifically designed for. The ability of 50 caliber rounds to penetrate brick and stone walls made the M2 an ideal weapon for engaging enemy positions in buildings. German defenders attempting to fortify buildings and create strongpoints found that interior walls and floors offered little protection against M2 fire. American tactics in urban combat often involved using M2s to suppress windows and firing ports in buildings while infantry maneuvered to assault positions or demolition teams moved forward with explosive charges. The psychological effect on German defenders was severe, as they could not rely on the protection of substantial buildings to shield them from American fire. One German officer captured at Aachen described the experience of being under 50 caliber fire in a 3-story office building as terrifying. The rounds would punch through the exterior wall, creating fist-sized holes, travel through multiple interior walls, and potentially exit through the opposite side of the building. Soldiers attempting to shelter inside such structures found that there was essentially nowhere safe to hide, as the M2 rounds seemed capable of finding them, regardless of how much masonry was between them and the firing position. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest, fought from September through December 1944, presented conditions that should have negated many of the M2's advantages. The dense forest canopy, limited visibility to a few dozen meters in many areas, and the terrain was too rough for most vehicles to operate effectively off the established roads and trails. However, American forces adapted their use of the M2 to the conditions and still found it effective. Tripod-mounted guns were positioned to cover the few clear lanes through the forest, particularly trails and fire breaks that German forces would need to use to move reinforcements or supplies. The M2's ability to penetrate tree trunks meant that even the forest itself provided limited protection against its fire. German soldiers attempting to use trees for cover found that 50 caliber rounds could punch through all but the largest trunks, showering the area with wooden splinters that caused casualties even when the bullets themselves missed. The grinding attrition of the Hürtgen Forest battle, which ultimately cost both sides tens of thousands of casualties, was made even more deadly for German forces by the presence of American M2s at key points throughout the forest. Every German counterattack, every attempt to reinforce threatened positions, every movement of supplies forward had to contend with the possibility of encountering American heavy machine gun fire that could not be effectively suppressed with the weapons German infantry units possessed. The Ardennes offensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge, represented Germany's last major offensive operation in the West and created circumstances where German forces initially had numerical and tactical advantage over surprised American units. The offensive, launched on December 16, 1944, achieved complete tactical surprise and pushed American forces back in several sectors. However, even in these desperate circumstances, the M2 proved its worth. American units that managed to establish defensive positions and bring their heavy weapons into action inflicted enormous casualties on attacking German forces. The defense of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division and attached units held out against overwhelming German forces, was sustained in part by the effective use of M2 machine guns. The defenders of Bastogne had limited artillery ammunition and could not always count on air support due to poor weather, but they did have adequate supplies of 50 caliber ammunition, and they used it lavishly to break up German attacks. German forces surrounding Bastogne found that approaching the American perimeter was suicidal during daylight hours, due to the concentrated fire from multiple M2 positions. Even at night, when visibility limited the M2's range advantage, American gunners used tracer ammunition to identify targets and achieve devastating results. The failure of German forces to overwhelm Bastogne before American relief forces arrived was due to many factors, but the defensive firepower provided by M2s and other American weapons was certainly among them. The effectiveness of the M2 in stopping German armour during the Battle of the Bulge surprised many observers, as the weapon was not designed as an anti-tank gun, and German tanks should have been largely immune to its fire. However, circumstance and tactics combined to make the M2 effective even against heavy armour in some situations. German tank columns advancing along narrow roads in the Ardennes could be channeled into kill zones, where American forces engaged them from multiple angles, while M2 fire might not penetrate frontal armour. Sustained fire on the sides and rear of German tanks could find weak points. More importantly, the M2 was devastatingly effective against German infantry and soft-skinned vehicles accompanying the armour. German Panzer Grenadier units, which provided essential support for armour operations, suffered terribly when they came under M2 fire. The destruction of infantry support often left German tanks isolated and vulnerable to American anti-tank weapons. At the Battle of Elsenborn Ridge, American defensive positions anchored by M2 machine guns helped stop the entire northern shoulder of the German offensive. German infantry attacks were shredded by concentrated fire, and when German armour attempted to advance without infantry support, it was engaged by American anti-tank guns and tank destroyers that the unsupported German tanks could not effectively suppress. German prisoners captured during the Battle of the Bulge provided interrogators with valuable insights into their perceptions of American firepower. Many expressed surprise at the volume of fire American units could generate, even when supposedly surrounded or cut off from support. They had expected that American units, when isolated and running low on supplies, would quickly exhaust their ammunition and become vulnerable to assault. Instead, they found that American positions continued to engage them with the same intensity, even days into the battle. This was particularly true of M2 positions, which continued firing as long as ammunition was available. The German assumption that American troops would be unable to maintain their lavish expenditure of ammunition when cut off from supply lines proved incorrect. American units had stockpiled enormous quantities of 50 caliber ammunition precisely because they knew its importance in defensive combat, and this foresight paid dividends during the Bulge. German soldiers also noted that American morale remained surprisingly high, even in difficult circumstances, and they attributed this partly to the confidence American troops had in their weapons. Knowing that they possessed superior firepower, even when surrounded, helped American units maintain cohesion and fighting effectiveness under conditions that might have caused other armies to collapse. The tactical problem the M2 posed for German forces became even more acute as the war moved into its final months and the quality of German replacements declined precipitously. Experienced German soldiers who had spent years on the Eastern Front fighting Soviet forces had developed sophisticated tactics for dealing with enemy firepower and knew how to exploit terrain and weather to minimize casualties while advancing. The young replacements who filled German ranks in early 1945 often lacked this experience and suffered accordingly. American commanders noted that German attacks in the final months of the war were often poorly coordinated and executed, with attacking troops advancing in predictable patterns that made them easy targets for M2 gunners. The combination of inexperienced German soldiers and American firepower superiority resulted in one-sided engagements where German casualties were catastrophic, while American losses remained comparatively light. Battle reports from American units in early 1945 frequently mentioned turning back German attacks with small arms fire alone, never needing to employ artillery or air support because the M2s and other machine guns broke up the attacks before they could develop. The crossing of the Rhine River in March 1945 represented another major set-piece operation, where the M2 played a crucial role. American forces conducting assault river crossings faced determined German resistance from defenders who held the advantage of terrain and prepared positions. However, American engineers and assault troops were supported by massive concentrations of firepower from the near bank of the Rhine, including hundreds of M2 machine guns. These weapons engaged German positions on the far bank, suppressing defensive fire, while assault boats made the crossing. The M2's range and accuracy made it ideal for this role, as gunners could pick out individual targets at distances exceeding a kilometre and engage them with precision fire. German defenders reported that the intensity of American fire made it nearly impossible to effectively engage the assault boats during their vulnerable crossing phase. By the time German defenders could bring effective fire to bear, American troops had already established footholds on the far bank, and additional forces were crossing under the protection of the initial assault waves. The speed with which American forces were able to establish bridgeheads across the Rhine was a testament to their tactical proficiency and material superiority, with the M2 playing its usual role as a force multiplier that allowed relatively small numbers of American troops to suppress much larger defensive forces. The final campaigns in Germany saw the M2 employed in roles that had become routine for American forces, but which still impressed and intimidated German defenders. Roadblocks and defensive positions were anchored by M2s that could engage targets at extreme range. Convoys moved with M2 armed vehicles, leading and trailing, ready to suppress ambushes or engage targets of opportunity. Occupation forces used M2s to secure key installations and intimidate potential resistance. The weapon had become so ubiquitous in American service that it was simply assumed that any significant American position would include at least one M2, and usually several. For German forces, this meant that every encounter with American units involved facing overwhelming firepower from weapons that outranged and outperformed their own. The sense of hopelessness this engendered contributed to the collapse of German resistance in the final weeks of the war, when soldiers know that they cannot effectively fight back against enemy weapons, when every attack results in prohibitive casualties, and when even successful tactical actions merely delay rather than prevent ultimate defeat, the will to continue fighting evaporates. The M2, as perhaps the most visible symbol of American material superiority, played a significant role in breaking German morale during the final campaigns of the war. While the European theatre saw the most extensive use of the M2 against German forces, it is worth noting that German military analysts were also aware of the weapon's effectiveness in the Pacific. Reports from Japanese forces describing their encounters with American firepower filtered back to Germany through various intelligence channels, and these reports reinforced German concerns about the M2's capabilities. Japanese soldiers, fighting in environments ranging from Pacific atolls to Southeast Asian jungles, consistently identified the American .50 caliber machine gun as one of the most dangerous weapons they faced. German staff officers studying These reports noted that the same complaints their own troops made about the M2 were echoed by Japanese forces. The weapon's excessive range, devastating hitting power, and seemingly unlimited ammunition supply were problems that neither Germany nor Japan had adequate solutions for. This realization that the M2 was equally effective across all theatres and against all types of troops reinforced the German understanding that they were facing an enemy whose material advantages were essentially insurmountable. German ordnance experts who examined captured M2 weapons produced detailed technical reports that praised the weapon's engineering and manufacturing quality. These reports noted that the M2 represented a design philosophy fundamentally different from German weapons development. Where German engineers often sought to maximize performance through complex mechanisms and tight tolerances, the M2 achieved its impressive performance through robust construction and brilliant basic design. The weapon used relatively simple operating principles but executed them flawlessly. German analysts calculated that the M2 required significantly less machining time than comparable German weapons, meaning that American industry could produce them in vast quantities without sacrificing quality. This was a troubling conclusion for German planners, who were struggling with declining production quality as the war progressed, and Germany's skilled labour force was depleted. The M2's design allowed it to be manufactured by semi-skilled workers using mass production techniques, while maintaining reliability and performance that exceeded weapons that required master craftsmen to produce. This meant that America could simultaneously produce more weapons and better weapons than Germany, a combination that was strategically devastating. The crew-served nature of the M2 also differed from German doctrine in ways that affected its battlefield performance. American M2 crews typically consisted of at least 3 soldiers: a gunner, an assistant gunner, and an ammunition bearer. In some circumstances, crews could be larger with additional ammunition bearers and security personnel. This allowed for sustained operation of the weapon, as crew members could rotate positions to prevent fatigue and maintain alertness. German machine gun crews were often smaller, as the Wehrmacht's chronic manpower shortages forced them to economize on personnel wherever possible. The result was that American M2 crews could maintain effective fire for longer periods and were less likely to make mistakes due to exhaustion. In defensive positions where both sides were employing machine guns, the ability to sustain fire over hours or even days of continuous combat gave American weapons crews a significant advantage. German gun crews, working with fewer personnel and often inadequate relief, would eventually succumb to fatigue and lose effectiveness. This meant that even in circumstances where the tactical situation seemed relatively stable, the passage of time favoured American forces, as their M2 crews remained fresh and alert, while German machine gunners became increasingly exhausted. The anti-aircraft role of the M2 deserves particular attention, as this was one area where German forces encountered the weapon in circumstances that left them uniquely vulnerable. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated the skies over Europe in the early years of the war, found itself increasingly on the defensive as American air power grew. By 1943, German pilots operating over territories controlled or contested by American ground forces had to contend with dense networks of anti-aircraft weapons, among which the M2 featured prominently. The standard American anti-aircraft mounting for the M2 was the M51 mount, which allowed for quick traversing and elevation changes to track fast-moving aircraft targets. More fearsome still was the M45 quad mount, known officially as the Maxon mount, which combined 4 M2 machine guns on a single electrically powered turret. This system could fire over 2,000 rounds per minute of 50 caliber ammunition and was capable of engaging aircraft at altitudes up to 3,000 feet. German pilots who survived attacks on American convoys or positions defended by quad-mounted M2s described the experience as flying through a solid wall of tracers. The volume of fire was such that evasion seemed impossible, and the kinetic energy of 50 caliber rounds was sufficient to cause catastrophic damage to aircraft structures even from glancing hits. Luftwaffe tactical doctrine had emphasized high-speed, low-altitude attacks on ground targets as a way to minimize exposure to anti-aircraft fire and maximize accuracy. This approach had worked well against British and Soviet ground forces in earlier phases of the war, as their anti-aircraft defences were often inadequate or poorly Coordinated, American forces presented an entirely different challenge. Every significant American formation included organic anti-aircraft capabilities, and these were integrated into a sophisticated system that coordinated radar detection, visual observation, and overlapping fields of fire. German pilots attempting to attack American columns or encampments found that they came under fire from multiple M2 positions simultaneously, creating crossfire patterns that were nearly impossible to evade. The psychological stress of these missions was intense, as pilots knew that even a momentary exposure to the concentrated fire of multiple 50 caliber guns could result in fatal damage to their aircraft. Pilot quality in the Luftwaffe declined sharply in 1944 and 1945 as experienced aviators were killed faster than they could be replaced, and the new pilots often lacked the skill to successfully execute ground attack missions against American forces defended by M2 weapons. The result was that German tactical air support became increasingly ineffective on the Western Front, not because the Luftwaffe lacked aircraft or pilots, but because the losses incurred in ground attack missions were unsustainable. The naval application of the M2 provided German U-boat crews with their own nightmare encounters with the weapon. American destroyer escorts and patrol craft bristled with M2 machine guns for use against U-boats caught on the surface. A surfaced U-boat was extremely vulnerable to machine gun fire, as the submarine's pressure hull was relatively thin and not designed to resist even small arms fire. The conning tower and deck guns were particularly exposed, and M2 fire could kill or wound crew members and damage equipment essential for the submarine's operation. When Allied warships detected a U-boat and forced it to surface, either through depth charge attack or because the submarine's batteries were exhausted, the outcome was often decided by machine gun fire rather than larger weapons. American warships would close on the surface submarine and rake it with 50 caliber fire, killing the crew and ensuring the vessel could not dive again. U-boat survivors who were rescued after their vessels were sunk reported that the experience of being under M2 fire on a submarine's deck was terrifying beyond description. There was nowhere to take cover, the thin metal of the submarine's hull offered no protection, and the massive 50 caliber rounds seemed to be coming from every direction at once. Many U-boat crews chose to surrender immediately rather than face the alternative of being systematically slaughtered by machine gun fire. The psychological impact of the M2 on German forces cannot be separated from the broader context of American material superiority, but the weapon became a symbol of that superiority in ways that other American weapons did not. German soldiers could understand and even respect tanks, artillery, and aircraft as weapons that required significant industrial capacity to produce. These were prestige weapons that demonstrated technological sophistication, but the M2, despite its effectiveness, was fundamentally just a machine gun. The fact that America could afford to mount such powerful weapons on individual vehicles, could supply them with seemingly unlimited ammunition, and could deploy them in such vast quantities drove home the message that Germany was fighting an enemy whose resources were essentially inexhaustible. Every jeep with a pedestal-mounted M2 represented resources that the Wehrmacht could never match. Every convoy rolling through French villages with M2s, mounted on every third vehicle, was a demonstration of American wealth and industrial capacity. German soldiers who had been told that the Americans were soft and would collapse under determined attack instead found themselves facing opponents who seemed to have an infinite supply of the most modern and effective weapons. The M2 became the visible proof that the propaganda they had been fed about American weakness was false. German prisoners of war, particularly those captured in the final year of the war, often expressed a sense of relief at being out of combat specifically because they would no longer have to face American firepower. Interrogation reports from 1945 include numerous statements from German soldiers who describe American weapons, and the M2 in particular, with a mixture of fear and grudging admiration. They recognized the weapon's effectiveness and understood that facing it in combat was likely to result in death or serious injury. The fact that capture represented an escape from this threat contributed to the increasing willingness of German soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death. Why continue fighting when the enemy possessed such overwhelming advantages in firepower? The M2, as one of the most visible and consistently encountered American weapons, played a significant role in undermining German will to resist. It was one thing to face superior numbers or better tactics, both of which could potentially be overcome through German fighting spirit, and tactical excellence. It was quite another to face weapons that could kill you from ranges where you couldn't effectively shoot back, and to know that your enemy had thousands of such weapons while your own forces made do with increasingly obsolete and poorly maintained equipment. The sound signature of the M2 became so well known to German troops that they could often identify its presence without seeing the weapon itself. Combat veterans developed the ability to distinguish between different weapons based on their rate of fire and the sound of their reports. The M2's distinctive cadence, slower than the MG42 but heavier and more resonant, was instantly recognizable. German soldiers would often react to the sound of M2 fire even before they could identify the source of the shooting, diving for cover or retreating from exposed positions purely based on audio cues. This Pavlovian response was the result of countless encounters where the sound of the M2 had preceded incoming fire that could not be effectively evaded. Military psychologists studying combat stress in the post-war period identified the sound of particular weapons as a significant factor in the development of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. For German veterans of the Western Front, the sound of the M2 often triggered stress responses years or even decades after the war ended. The weapon's distinctive report had been so thoroughly associated with danger and death that merely hearing a similar sound could cause intense anxiety in combat veterans. The training American soldiers received in the employment of the M2 emphasized not just technical proficiency, but also tactical judgment. Gunners were taught to identify high-value targets and prioritize them appropriately. German officers, who were often identifiable by their different uniforms or equipment, were priority targets for M2 gunners. German machine gun positions, which represented the primary threat to advancing American infantry, were engaged with concentrated fire to neutralize them before they could inflict significant casualties. German armoured vehicles, even when they were too heavily protected for the M2 to penetrate, were engaged to suppress their supporting infantry and limit their effectiveness. This sophisticated target prioritization meant that M2 fire was not simply sprayed randomly across the battlefield, but was carefully directed at targets where it would have maximum effect. German tactical manuals from late in the war specifically warned troops about the tendency of American heavy machine gunners to target officers and NCOs, and recommended that leaders avoid distinctive uniform items or behaviors that might mark them as high-value targets. The effectiveness of this advice was limited, as German small units' tactics required visible leadership from junior officers and NCOs, and attempts to blend in with common soldiers often resulted in reduced unit cohesion and command effectiveness. The logistical support required to maintain M2 weapons in combat was extensive, but American supply systems proved more than adequate to the task. Each M2 required regular maintenance, including cleaning, lubrication, and periodic barrel changes. Ammunition had to be transported to gun positions in enormous quantities, as a single M2 could easily expend several thousand rounds during a day of heavy combat. Spare parts had to be available to replace components that broke or wore out. Despite these requirements, American forces rarely experienced significant downtime due to maintenance or supply issues with their M2 weapons. The contrast with German forces, who struggled increasingly with maintenance and supply problems as the war progressed, was stark. German machine gunners often had to conserve ammunition carefully and ration their fire, sometimes being unable to engage targets that they could clearly see because they lacked sufficient ammunition. M2 gunners faced no such constraints and could engage targets freely, confident that more ammunition would be available when needed. This difference in logistical support translated directly into battlefield effectiveness, as American weapons crews could maintain continuous pressure on German forces, while German crews were forced to husband their resources carefully. The evolution of American combined arms tactics around the M2's capabilities demonstrated the flexibility and adaptability of American military doctrine. Early in the war, American tactical employment of the M2 was relatively conventional, following pre-war doctrine that emphasized the weapon's long-range suppressive fire capabilities. As combat experience accumulated, American units developed new tactics that exploited the M2's full potential. Infantry tank cooperation tactics evolved to include M2 armed vehicles as intermediary support, providing fire that was heavier than infantry weapons but more responsive than tank main guns. Artillery forward observers used M2 fire to mark targets for artillery strikes, with tracer rounds indicating the precise locations that needed to be engaged with heavier weapons. Air support coordination improved as ground forces learned to use M2 tracers to mark enemy positions for attacking aircraft, creating a system where the same weapon could be used for direct fire engagement and target designation simultaneously. These tactical innovations made American combined arms teams progressively more effective as the war continued, while German forces, hampered by rigid doctrine and declining training standards, were unable to match this rate of tactical evolution. The impact of the M2 on German vehicle design and armor doctrine was subtle but real. German engineers studying reports of American .50 caliber effectiveness against light armor began incorporating thicker side and rear armor on vehicles where weight constraints allowed it. The Stug 3 assault gun, which went through multiple upgrades during the war, received additional armor specifically to protect against anti-tank rifles and heavy machine guns after reports of vulnerability to such weapons reached development teams. However, these armor improvements came at the cost of weight and mobility, as Germany lacked the powerful engines that might have allowed their vehicles to carry heavier armor without performance penalties. American vehicles, benefiting from powerful engines and excellent suspension systems, could often carry substantial armor protection without significant mobility losses. The M4 Sherman tank, despite its reputation for relatively thin armor compared to German heavy tanks, was essentially immune to M2 fire except at point-blank range against very specific weak points. This meant that American armor could operate in the same battle space as M2 machine guns without significant fratricidal risk, while German light armor had to be extremely cautious about entering areas where friendly heavy weapons were engaging targets. The testimony of German medical personnel provides another perspective on the M2's effectiveness and the fear it generated among German troops. Field hospitals and aid stations in the final year of the war treated thousands of casualties caused by .50 caliber rounds, and the medical officers responsible for this treatment developed a deep understanding of the weapon's effects on the human body. Wounds from .50 caliber rounds were categorically different from rifle or pistol wounds. The massive projectile created wound channels measured in inches rather than millimeters, and the hydrostatic shock often caused damage to tissues and organs far from the actual bullet path. Surgical treatment of .50 caliber wounds was often futile, as the extent of tissue destruction was simply too great for the medical techniques available in the 1940s to repair. Limbs struck by .50 caliber rounds almost always required immediate amputation, as attempts to save the limb through surgical reconstruction were nearly always unsuccessful and often led to fatal infections. Torso wounds were almost invariably fatal, with death occurring either immediately from massive tissue damage and blood loss or within hours from shock and organ failure. Head wounds from .50 caliber rounds were universally fatal, with the projectile's energy sufficient to completely destroy the skull and brain tissue. German medical officers noted in their reports that soldiers who survived encounters with American M2 fire were generally those who had been missed entirely or struck only by fragments from near misses. Direct hits were survivable only in the rarest circumstances, usually involving extreme range and the round having passed through other obstacles first, thereby losing much of its energy. The interrogation of German soldiers captured in various theatres revealed consistent patterns in their descriptions of the M2 and its psychological impact. Feldwebel Ernst Bachmann, a Panzer ace captured in March 1945, described in his interrogation how American M2 fire had influenced German armor tactics. He explained that German tank commanders had learned to avoid routes and positions that exposed them to concentrated M2 fire, even though the rounds could not penetrate their tank's main armor. The reason was simple. The supporting infantry that tanks needed to survive on the battlefield were extremely vulnerable to .50 caliber fire, and losing that infantry support left tanks vulnerable to American anti-tank weapons. He recounted an incident where his Panther tank had been advancing with a platoon of Panzer Grenadiers when they came under fire from what he estimated were 3 or 4 M2 machine guns positioned on a ridge approximately 800 meters away. His tank was not damaged, but within minutes, more than half of the accompanying infantry were casualties. Without infantry support, he was forced to withdraw rather than continue the advance, as attempting to proceed without infantry protection would have exposed his tank to American bazooka teams that he knew were waiting in the village ahead. This incident exemplified how the M2 could achieve tactical effects far beyond simply destroying targets through direct fire. By eliminating supporting elements, the weapon could neutralize threats that it could not directly engage. Another captured German officer, Hauptmann Klaus Möller, who had served in Italy and later on the Western Front in Germany itself, provided a comparative assessment of facing different Allied forces. He noted that British and Canadian forces, while formidable, used their heavy weapons somewhat differently than Americans. The British employed their .303 Vickers machine guns effectively, but lacked the long-range punch of the M2. Soviet forces, which he had not personally faced but which other German officers described to him, relied heavily on massed artillery and rockets, but their small arms fire, while intense, lacked precision. American forces, in his assessment, achieved the most effective combination of precision and volume in their small arms fire, with the M2 being the weapon that most clearly demonstrated this capability. He described American defensive positions as being layered in depth, with M2 weapons positioned to cover specific sectors and create overlapping fields of fire that made it nearly impossible to find covered approaches. Attacking such positions required either overwhelming artillery preparation, which German forces increasingly lacked the ammunition to provide, or acceptance of catastrophic casualties among the assault troops. He stated bluntly that by early 1945, most German officers were unwilling to order attacks on well-prepared American positions because they knew the result would be the destruction of their units for no meaningful gain. The effectiveness of the M2 in ambush situations particularly impressed and frightened German troops. American reconnaissance units and infantry patrols often set up hasty ambush positions along routes they suspected German forces would use, and these ambushes typically included at least one M2 for its shock value and killing power. When an ambush was sprung, the opening seconds of engagement were critical, and the M2's ability to deliver devastating fire immediately gave American ambush parties a decisive advantage. German columns moving along roads or trails could be decimated by a single well-placed M2 before they could deploy and return effective fire. The standard German response to ambush was to immediately assault toward the source of fire, attempting to overwhelm the ambushers through aggressive action. This tactic had worked well against partisan forces and less well-equipped enemies, but against American ambushes anchored by M2 fire, it often resulted in enormous casualties without successfully eliminating the ambush party. The American troops would maintain fire until the last safe moment, inflicting maximum casualties, and then withdraw in good order, often covered by additional M2 positions that had been established to protect their retreat. German units that had been ambushed in this fashion reported that they rarely managed to inflict significant casualties on the American ambush parties, while their own losses were often severe. The strategic implications of the M2's effectiveness extended beyond individual tactical engagements. German military planners understood that the proliferation of heavy weapons in American units represented a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare. Traditional military theory held that heavy weapons were relatively rare on the battlefield, and that most combat would be decided by rifle-armed infantry supported by a limited number of machine guns and artillery pieces. The American model, which distributed heavy weapons throughout the force structure to an unprecedented degree, challenged these assumptions. Every American infantry company had a weapons platoon that included M2 machine guns. Every tank platoon had M2s as secondary armament. Every convoy had M2 armed vehicles for security. Every defensive position included M2S for long-range engagement. This saturation of the battlefield with heavy weapons meant that German forces could never achieve the kind of local superiority that their tactical doctrine relied upon. No matter where German units attempted to attack or defend, they would face American M2 fire. No matter how carefully they planned their operations, they could not avoid encountering this weapon. The psychological burden of this certainty wore down German combat effectiveness over time, as soldiers became increasingly convinced that every operation would result in exposure to devastating fire that their own weapons could not match. The Battle of the Bulge provides numerous specific examples of the M2's tactical impact in critical engagements. At the crossroads town of St. Vith, American defenders used M2 fire to break up repeated German attacks from December 17th through December 21st, 1944. The town's defensive positions included numerous M2s positioned to cover all approaches, and German forces found that they could not mass infantry for assault without suffering prohibitive casualties from 50 caliber fire. When German armor attempted to advance without infantry support, American tank destroyers and anti-tank guns engaged them effectively, destroying multiple German tanks. The defenders of St. Vith eventually had to withdraw when they were nearly surrounded, but the delay they imposed on the German advance was crucial to the overall Allied response to the offensive. German after-action reports from units that fought at St. Vith specifically mentioned the effectiveness of American heavy machine gunfire and noted that casualties among assault infantry were far higher than expected. At Elsenborn Ridge, another critical defensive position, American M2 gunners engaged German infantry at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters, breaking up attacks before they could develop momentum. The concentration of M2 fire at Elsenborn was so intense that German soldiers described it as impenetrable, and multiple attacks were called off after achieving only negligible gains at enormous cost. The experience of German paratroopers facing American M2 fire deserves particular mention, as these elite troops were among the best trained and most highly motivated soldiers in the Wehrmacht. Fallschirmjäger units that fought in Italy and later in the Battle of the Bulge consistently encountered American positions defended by M2s, and their experiences mirror those of regular infantry, but with additional insights from professional soldiers who understood tactical nuance. Oberjäger Heinrich Vogt, a paratrooper who fought at Monte Cassino and survived the war, described in post-war interviews how his unit's attack on an American position had been stopped by concentrated M2 fire. His company had been tasked with capturing a ridge held by American forces, and intelligence had indicated that the defenders were relatively weak. The reality proved very different. As his unit advanced across approximately 600 meters of broken ground, they came under fire from what he estimated were 6 or 7 M2 machine guns positioned at different points along the ridge. The fire was methodical and precise, with gunners engaging specific targets rather than simply spraying the area with bullets. His company lost 30 men killed and another 40 wounded in less than 10 minutes of engagement, and the attack was called off without ever reaching the American positions. He noted that the American gunners demonstrated excellent fire discipline, firing controlled bursts rather than sustained automatic fire, which made it difficult to pinpoint their exact positions for counterfire. This tactical sophistication, combined with the weapon's inherent lethality, made American M2 positions exceptionally difficult to neutralize. The naval infantry or beach defense units that German forces employed along the Atlantic Wall had their own devastating encounters with American M2 fire during amphibious operations. At Omaha Beach on D-Day, German defenders initially believed they were successfully repelling the invasion, as American casualties in the early waves were extremely heavy. However, as more American troops and equipment came ashore, the balance of firepower shifted decisively. Vehicles with mounted M2s began moving off the beach and engaging German positions, while naval vessels offshore added their own 50 caliber fire to the barrage. German strongpoints that had seemed impregnable when only facing rifle fire from pinned-down infantry suddenly found themselves under attack from weapons that could penetrate their fortifications. Concrete bunkers and pillboxes were not vulnerable to M2 fire directly, but the vision ports and firing slits that defenders needed to engage targets could be targeted by accurate 50 caliber fire. German gunners attempting to use these openings were killed or forced to take cover, reducing the effectiveness of their defensive fire. As American forces established themselves on the beach and began moving inland, the presence of M2s on vehicles gave them mobile firepower that could respond to German counterattacks immediately. The speed with which American forces transitioned from barely holding the beach to breaking through German defenses was partly due to the flexibility and effectiveness of their heavy weapons, with the M2 playing a crucial role in this transformation. The German assessment of American air superiority was fundamentally linked to the M2's effectiveness in aerial combat. Luftwaffe intelligence officers analyzed combat loss data throughout the war and concluded that American fighters were the most dangerous opponents their pilots faced, not because of superior pilot skill or aircraft performance, but because of the concentration of M2 armament. A German FW-190 fighter carried 2 13mm machine guns and 4 20mm cannons, an impressive armament that could destroy any target with a solid hit. However, the different ballistics of these weapons made precision aiming difficult, as pilots had to account for different trajectories depending on which weapons they were firing. American fighters with 6 or 8 M2 machine guns had no such complications. All their weapons had identical ballistics, all fired at the same rate, and all delivered devastating hitting power. This meant that American pilots could aim their aircraft at a target and know that all their weapons would impact at the same point. The simplicity of this system translated into combat effectiveness, as American pilots could focus on tactics and maneuvering rather than complex gunnery calculations. German pilots increasingly avoided combat with American fighters when possible, and when combat was unavoidable, they attempted to use hit-and-run tactics that minimized exposure to American defensive fire. The psychological advantage this gave American pilots was considerable, as they could approach combat engagements with confidence that their armament was superior to anything the Germans could bring to bear. The rare instances where German forces successfully captured and employed M2 weapons provides insight into the weapon's effectiveness from another perspective. When German troops overran American positions and captured M2s with adequate ammunition, they sometimes incorporated these weapons into their own defensive positions. German gun crews who operated captured M2s invariably reported that the weapon was superior to their own heavy machine guns in terms of range, hitting power, and reliability. However, they also noted that the weapon's weight and ammunition consumption made it difficult to employ without the logistical support that American forces took for granted. A German infantry company that captured an M2 might be able to keep it in action for a few days, but without a steady supply of .50 caliber ammunition and spare parts, the weapon would eventually have to be abandoned or relegated to a static defensive position where its remaining ammunition could be employed most effectively. Some German units went to considerable efforts to maintain captured M2s in service, scrounging ammunition from destroyed American vehicles and stockpiling it for critical defensive battles. These efforts demonstrated how highly German soldiers valued the weapon, even as they recognized that they could never hope to employ it as effectively as American forces did, due to supply limitations. The fact that German troops preferred captured American weapons to their own issued equipment spoke volumes about the quality disparity between American and German small arms by the final years of the war. The integration of the M2 into American combined arms doctrine created a system where the weapon's effectiveness was multiplied by its employment alongside other arms. When American forces conducted deliberate attacks on prepared German positions, the sequence of events typically followed a well-rehearsed pattern. Artillery would begin with preparatory fires to suppress German defences and destroy identified strongpoints. As the artillery lifted, aircraft would strafe and bomb German positions to maintain suppression. Infantry would then advance under the cover of M2 fire from supporting weapons platoons and vehicle-mounted guns. Tanks would move forward with the infantry, their own M2s engaging targets that didn't require main gun fire. This layered approach to applying firepower meant that German defenders were under continuous pressure from the moment the attack began until American troops were physically occupying their positions. The M2's role in this system was to provide the constant, accurate fire that prevented German troops from recovering from artillery and air bombardment, maintaining suppression until American infantry could close with the defenders. German forces attempting to employ similar combined arms tactics found that their own heavy weapons lacked the range and hitting power to achieve comparable effects, and their artillery ammunition shortages meant that they could rarely match American preparatory bombardments. The systematic application of overwhelming firepower with the M2 as a critical component represented a form of warfare that German forces were ill-equipped to counter. The testimony of civilians in combat zones provides yet another perspective on the M2's impact. French, Belgian, and German civilians who witnessed battles involving American forces consistently noted the volume and intensity of American fire. They described the sound of combat when American units were engaged as being qualitatively different from battles involving other armies, with a higher proportion of heavy weapons fire and a more sustained tempo of engagement. The M2's distinctive sound was often mentioned in these accounts, as civilians learned to recognize the weapon and understand that its presence indicated American forces were nearby. In some cases, this recognition provided a measure of reassurance, as civilians understood that American firepower superiority made it likely that any German counterattacks would be defeated. In other cases, particularly during the confused fighting of the Battle of the Bulge, the sound of M2 fire in the distance helped civilians determine where American defensive lines were located and which areas to avoid. The weapon had become so ubiquitous and distinctive that it served as an audible marker of American military presence throughout the combat zones of Western Europe. The final months of the war in Europe saw the M2 employed in circumstances that highlighted both its versatility and the hopelessness of Germany's strategic position. As American forces pushed into Germany itself in early 1945, they encountered a mixture of fanatical resistance from hardcore Nazi units and rapid collapse among demoralized defenders who recognized that the war was lost. In both cases, the M2 played a crucial role in determining outcomes. Against determined defenders, such as the Waffen-SS units that held key cities and river crossings, American forces employed their overwhelming firepower advantage to systematically reduce German positions while minimizing their own casualties. M2S positioned on the outskirts of contested towns would engage any German movement, forcing defenders to shelter in buildings during daylight hours and attempt resupply and reinforcement only under cover of darkness. This restriction on German mobility allowed American forces to isolate defensive positions and reduce them methodically. Against defenders who were willing to surrender, the presence of M2s provided both incentive and opportunity. German soldiers could see the futility of resistance when faced with such overwhelming firepower, and the knowledge that surrender to American forces would likely result in reasonable treatment made capitulation an attractive option compared to fighting to the death against impossible odds. The crossing of the Remagen Bridge over the Rhine on March 7, 1945, represented one of the war's most significant tactical achievements and showcased the M2's role in exploiting unexpected opportunities. When American forces discovered that the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen had not been destroyed by German engineers, they immediately moved to secure it before German forces could react. M2 armed vehicles were among the first across the bridge, and they established defensive positions on the far bank that allowed additional American units to cross in relative safety. German attempts to destroy the bridge with artillery fire and air attack were hindered by American anti-aircraft defenses, including numerous M2 positions that engaged German aircraft attempting to bomb the structure. The quad-mounted M2S proved particularly effective in this role, shooting down several German planes and forcing others to attack from higher altitudes, where their accuracy was compromised. Within days, American forces had established a substantial bridgehead on the east bank of the Rhine, and the M2s that had been instrumental in securing this position were redeployed to expand the perimeter and engage German counterattacks. The psychological impact of the Remagen bridgehead on German morale was considerable, as it demonstrated that even the Rhine, which Hitler had declared would be Germany's final defensive barrier, could not stop American forces equipped with superior weapons and training. The RAF fighting in the Ruhr pocket during April 1945 demonstrated the M2's effectiveness in encirclement operations. American forces had surrounded more than 300,000 German troops in the industrial region of the Ruhr, creating Germany's largest military disaster of the Western Front. The encircled German forces attempted several breakout attempts, but these were consistently defeated by American defensive fire. M2 positions formed the backbone of American defensive lines, engaging German assault forces at maximum range and breaking up attacks before they could generate momentum. German officers who surrendered after the pocket collapsed described the futility of attempting to break through American lines when every approach was covered by heavy machine gun fire that their own weapons could not suppress. The defenders had unlimited ammunition and clear fields of fire, while the German attackers had to advance across open ground with dwindling ammunition supplies and no hope of reinforcement. The choice between surrender and annihilation was not difficult to make, and by April 18, 1945, the Ruhr pocket had ceased to exist as organised resistance collapsed. Among the equipment captured by American forces were numerous German weapons and vehicles, but interrogation of prisoners revealed that even when German units had adequate equipment, they lacked the ammunition and fuel to employ it effectively. The contrast with American forces, who could afford to expend enormous quantities of ammunition on even minor engagements, was not lost on German soldiers who had spent years fighting under conditions of material scarcity. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany created another context in which German forces encountered American M2 firepower with devastating results. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe's fighter force had been essentially destroyed, and American bomber formations could operate over Germany with near impunity. The defensive firepower of these bomber formations, based primarily on the M2, had played a crucial role in achieving this air superiority. German fighter pilots who survived the war consistently identified the defensive armament of American bombers as one of the primary factors in the Luftwaffe's defeat. They explained that the losses incurred in attacking bomber formations were simply unsustainable, and that even when attacks succeeded in downing American aircraft, the cost in German fighters and pilots was prohibitive. By 1945, experienced German fighter pilots were extremely rare, and the replacement pilots being sent to frontline units often had less than 100 hours of flying time before being committed to combat. These inexperienced pilots stood virtually no chance against the combined defensive fire of American bomber formations and the aggressive tactics of American escort fighters. The result was that Germany's cities and industrial facilities were systematically destroyed from the air, while the Luftwaffe was unable to mount effective resistance. The M2, as the primary weapon used to defend American bombers, had contributed directly to Germany's strategic defeat by helping to establish air superiority that allowed the bombing campaign to proceed unimpeded. German soldiers captured in the final weeks of the war often expressed a sense of relief that bordered on joy at being out of combat. Interrogation reports from April and May 1945 include numerous statements from German prisoners who describe being overwhelmed by American firepower and grateful to have survived. The M2 features prominently in many of these accounts, with prisoners describing the weapon as representative of the overwhelming material advantages American forces enjoyed. One Obergefreiter captured near the Elbe River told his interrogators that his unit had been equipped with obsolete French rifles captured in 1940, while the Americans facing them had seemed to have unlimited quantities of modern weapons, including heavy machine guns on every vehicle. He described watching an American convoy move past his hiding position after his unit had been scattered by an artillery barrage and counting over 20 M2 machine guns on the various vehicles in a column that took less than 10 minutes to pass. This visible demonstration of American wealth and industrial capacity had convinced him that continuing to fight was pointless, and he had surrendered at the first opportunity. His attitude was typical of many German soldiers in the final weeks of the war, who recognized that Germany's defeat was inevitable and saw no reason to die for a lost cause. The psychological impact of the M2 extended beyond individual soldiers to affect German civilian morale as well. Civilians in German cities that came under American occupation quickly became familiar with the sight of M2 armed American vehicles patrolling the streets and establishing checkpoints. The visible presence of these weapons served as a reminder that American forces possessed overwhelming power and that resistance would be futile. This psychological effect aided in the establishment of order in occupied territories, as potential resistors understood that they would be facing weapons that had defeated Germany's professional military forces. The M2 became a symbol of American military might in the immediate post-war period, and its presence helped establish the credibility of American occupation forces throughout Western Germany. German civilians who had been subjected to years of propaganda about American weakness and decadence found that reality contradicted everything they had been told, and the M2 was one of the most visible pieces of evidence that undermined Nazi claims about American military inferiority. The technical evolution of the M2 during the war demonstrated American industry's ability to refine and improve even successful weapons. The basic M2 design remained unchanged throughout the conflict, but manufacturing processes were continuously improved to increase production rates and reduce costs. The introduction of the M2HB, or heavy barrel variant, in 1938 had increased the weapon's sustained fire capability by using a heavier barrel that could absorb more heat before requiring replacement. During the war, American manufacturers produced hundreds of thousands of M2 machine guns, equipping not just American forces but also supplying Allied nations through Lend-Lease. British Commonwealth forces received thousands of M2s, which they employed alongside their own weapons with great success. Soviet forces also received some M2s, though they were less enthusiastic about the weapon than Western allies, preferring their own heavy machine guns, which fired different ammunition and fit better into Soviet logistical systems. The sheer scale of M2 production, over 400,000 units manufactured during World War II alone, demonstrated American industrial capacity in ways that impressed allies and intimidated enemies. The post-war assessment of the M2's effectiveness by military historians and analysts has been universally positive. The weapon is recognized as one of the most successful military firearms ever designed, with a service life that has now exceeded a century and shows no signs of ending. The fundamental soundness of John Browning's original design, combined with the weapon's adaptability to different roles and mounting systems, has kept the M2 relevant through multiple generations of warfare. German military analysts conducting post-war assessments of American weapons consistently rated the M2 as one of the most effective small arms employed during the conflict. They noted that the weapon's combination of range, accuracy, and hitting power had given American forces capabilities that German forces could not match with any single weapon system. The closest German equivalent would have required combining several different weapons, a heavy machine gun for suppressive fire, an anti-tank rifle for armor penetration, and an anti-aircraft gun for engaging aircraft, to achieve the versatility that the M2 provided in a single package. This integration of multiple capabilities into a single, reliable weapon system represented a significant tactical advantage that American forces exploited effectively throughout the war. The lessons learned from the M2's employment during World War II influenced post-war weapons development in numerous ways. The success of the .50 caliber cartridge led many nations to develop their own heavy machine gun cartridges and weapons, though few achieved the same balance of power and practicality that the M2 demonstrated. The Soviet Union developed the DSHK heavy machine gun, firing a 12.7 by 108 mm round that was roughly comparable to the .50 caliber BMG. Other nations adopted variations on the .50 caliber concept, or simply purchased M2s directly from American manufacturers. The weapon's influence extended beyond heavy machine guns to affect the design of vehicle armament, aircraft weapons, and anti-aircraft systems. The principle that heavy, powerful weapons could be deployed at the squad and platoon level, rather than being restricted to specialized units, became a standard feature of modern military organization. American doctrine, which emphasized giving small units access to heavy firepower, was copied by many armies precisely because it had proven so effective during World War II, with the M2 serving as the exemplar of this approach. The human cost of the M2's effectiveness is difficult to quantify, but was certainly substantial. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed or wounded by .50 caliber fire during the war, and many more were suppressed or intimidated by its presence on the battlefield. The weapon's psychological impact may have been as significant as its direct lethal effects, as German troops learned to fear and respect the M2 in ways that affected their tactical decisions and willingness to engage. American forces. The breakdown of German morale in the final year of the war was attributable to many factors: strategic defeats, declining living conditions, recognition that the war was lost, but the daily experience of facing superior American firepower certainly contributed to this collapse of will. German soldiers who knew that every engagement with American forces would involve exposure to weapons they could not match had little incentive to fight with the same determination that had characterized earlier phases of the war. The M2, as perhaps the most visible and consistently encountered American weapon, played a role in this psychological defeat that complemented its tactical effectiveness. The technical specifications of the M2, which seemed impressive but not revolutionary when the weapon was first developed in the 1920s, proved to be perfectly suited to the conditions of World War II combat. The .50 caliber cartridge sat in a performance sweet spot where it was powerful, enough to be effective against a wide range of targets, yet not so powerful that it became impractical to employ or transport in quantity. A larger cartridge, such as the 20mm rounds used in aircraft cannon, would have provided more hitting power, but would have required a heavier weapon and more complex ammunition logistics. A smaller cartridge would have lacked the range and penetration necessary to engage armoured vehicles and aircraft effectively. The M2's intermediate position allowed it to serve effectively in roles ranging from infantry support to anti-aircraft defense, making it the most versatile heavy weapon in the American arsenal. German weapons developers studying the M2 after the war concluded that they had no equivalent weapon and that attempting to develop one would have required significant resources and time that Germany simply didn't have during the war years. The M2 represented a technological and doctrinal lead that American forces established early and maintained throughout the conflict. The stories of individual German soldiers who survived encounters with M2 fire provide poignant testimony to the weapon's impact on those who faced it. Gefreiter Hans Schmidt, a Wehrmacht infantryman who fought in Normandy and was captured in August 1944, described in post-war interviews how his entire squad had been caught in the open by M2 fire during an attempted counterattack near St. Lo. He was the only survivor, having been knocked unconscious by a near miss and subsequently found by American medics who treated his wounds and evacuated him to a field hospital. He described the experience of being under .50 caliber fire as unlike anything else in his combat experience, which included fighting on the Eastern Front. The sound of the rounds passing overhead, the size of the impacts when they hit the ground, and the devastating wounds inflicted on his comrades all combined to create a sense of overwhelming terror that he said he had never experienced, even during Soviet artillery barrages. His survival was pure chance, and he knew it. That knowledge, he explained, made it impossible for him to view combat the same way afterward. He was simply grateful to be alive and to be out of the war, and he expressed sympathy for German soldiers who were still facing American forces in the final months of the conflict. Another survivor, Unteroffizier Friedrich Weber, who served in a panzer unit during the Battle of the Bulge, described how American M2 fire had influenced German armor tactics during the offensive. He explained that his unit had been ordered to advance along a specific route toward the Meuse River, but they had been forced to deviate from their assigned path multiple times due to encountering American M2 positions that made the planned route impassable. Each time they attempted to advance along roads or through villages where American forces had established defensive positions, they came under devastating fire that killed their supporting infantry and forced the tanks to withdraw. The cumulative effect of these delays was that his unit never reached its objective during the offensive, instead spending days trying to find routes that would allow them to advance without suffering catastrophic casualties. He noted that the American defenders seemed to have unlimited ammunition and were willing to expend it freely on any target that presented itself, while his own unit was constantly being told to conserve ammunition and fuel. By the time the offensive collapsed in late January 1945, his panzer unit had been reduced to a fraction of its starting strength, not primarily from tank losses, but from the decimation of supporting infantry who were vulnerable to M2 fire in ways that the tanks themselves were not. The final days of the war in Europe saw the M2 employed in roles that demonstrated how thoroughly it had been integrated into American military operations. When German forces in Italy surrendered on May 2nd, 1945, and German forces in northwestern Europe surrendered on May 4th, followed by the general surrender on May 8th. American forces were positioned throughout Germany and Austria, with M2s forming a crucial part of their security arrangements. The weapons that had helped defeat German military forces in combat now served to maintain order and deter any potential resistance during the occupation. The transition from combat operations to occupation duties was seamless for M2 crews, who simply shifted from engaging enemy forces to providing visible security and deterrent presence. The fact that the same weapon could serve effectively in both roles spoke to its versatility and the soundness of its basic design. German civilians and soldiers encountering American occupation forces found that the M2 remained a constant presence. A reminder that American military power was based not just on numbers or temporary advantages, but on superior equipment and organization that could be sustained indefinitely. The immediate post-war period saw extensive technical analysis of the M2 by both Allied and former enemy nations. German weapons experts who had been drafted into working for American intelligence services provided detailed assessments of how the M2 compared to German weapons and why it had been so effective. These reports consistently highlighted several key advantages that the M2 possessed. First was the cartridge itself, which provided an ideal balance of power and practicality. Second was the weapon's reliability, which German experts attributed to the generous tolerances in the design that allowed it to function even when dirty or damaged. Third was the ease of manufacture, which enabled mass production without sacrificing quality. Fourth was the versatility of mounting systems, which allowed the same basic weapon to be employed in vastly different roles. These assessments concluded that the M2 represented a superior approach to weapons design, prioritizing practical battlefield effectiveness over theoretical performance maximums. German weapons, by contrast, often achieved impressive specifications on paper, but proved difficult to manufacture in quantity or maintain in field conditions. The MG-42, while an excellent weapon in many respects, required skilled labour to produce and careful maintenance to keep functioning. The M2 could be manufactured by semi-skilled workers using mass production techniques and would continue operating even when subjected to abuse that would disable lesser weapons. The question of why Germany did not develop a comparable weapon during the war has multiple answers, all of which reflect the broader strategic situation Germany faced. First, German military doctrine did not emphasize the same kind of heavy weapons proliferation that characterized American forces. German planners believed that concentrated firepower at specific points was more important than distributing heavy weapons throughout the force structure. This meant that even if Germany had possessed a weapon comparable to the M2, they likely would not have employed it in the same way American forces did. Second, Germany's industrial capacity was increasingly strained by the demands of producing tanks, aircraft, and ammunition, leaving little room for developing entirely new weapon systems. The resources required to design, test, and mass-produce a new heavy machine gun would have had to come from other programs, and it was unclear that the benefits would justify the costs. Third, Germany's ammunition logistics were already complex, with multiple different calibers in use across various weapon systems. Adding another caliber would have further complicated an already strained supply system. Finally, by the time German planners recognized the tactical advantages the M2 provided American forces, it was too late to develop and field a response. The war's outcome had already been determined by broader strategic factors, and no single weapon system could have altered the final result. The human dimension of the M2's impact becomes clearer when examining personal accounts from German veterans collected decades after the war ended. Many German soldiers who faced American forces carried memories of the M2 with them for the rest of their lives. Veterans' reunions and historical interviews from the 1970s through the 2000s consistently feature references to the American .50 caliber machine gun and the fear it inspired. These veterans, speaking with the perspective of age and distance from the events, could articulate what had been difficult to express during the war itself, that the M2 represented a level of material superiority that made German victory impossible. Even the most dedicated Nazi believers, those who had fought until the final surrender, generally acknowledged in hindsight that facing American firepower had been a hopeless endeavor. The M2, more than almost any other single weapon, symbolized this disparity. It was not a secret weapon or a technological marvel, just a superbly designed and manufactured tool that American industry could produce in vast quantities, while German industry struggled to maintain production of more basic weapons. The legacy of the M2 extends far beyond World War II, as the weapon has remained in continuous American military service and has been adopted by dozens of other nations. The same basic design that fought in the hedgerows of Normandy and the streets of Aachen saw action in Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq, and countless other conflicts. This longevity is unprecedented for a military weapon and speaks to the fundamental excellence of John Browning's design. Modern M2s incorporate minor improvements in materials and manufacturing techniques, but the core mechanism remains unchanged from the version that entered service in 1933. German military analysts observing this continued service in post-war decades noted that Germany had never produced a weapon with comparable longevity and that the M2's century-long service life represented a level of design excellence that few weapons in history have achieved. The fact that modern soldiers, using advanced optics and fighting in vastly different tactical environments than their World War II predecessors, still find the M2 to be effective and reliable demonstrates that the weapon's designers achieved something truly remarkable. The comparative analysis of German and American heavy weapons reveals fundamental differences in design philosophy that reflected broader cultural and industrial disparities. German weapons engineering emphasized precision, sophisticated mechanisms, and achieving maximum performance from each design. This approach produced weapons that were often excellent when new and properly maintained, but that deteriorated in performance under field conditions. American weapons engineering emphasized reliability, ease of manufacture, and sustained performance under adverse conditions. This approach produced weapons that might not achieve the absolute maximum theoretical performance, but that would continue functioning reliably regardless of how they were treated. The M2 exemplified this American approach with its relatively simple operating mechanism, generous tolerances, and robust construction. A German engineer examining an M2 might note that tighter tolerances could improve accuracy or that more complex mechanisms could increase the rate of fire, but these potential improvements would come at the cost of the reliability that made the weapons so effective in combat. The Americans had chosen to prioritize the characteristics that mattered most on the battlefield, and the results spoke for themselves. The training infrastructure that supported American M2 employment was another factor that contributed to the weapon's effectiveness, and that German forces could not match. American soldiers who would operate the M2 in combat received extensive training on the weapon before being deployed overseas. This training covered not just basic operation, but also advanced topics like range estimation, leading moving targets, and coordinating fire with other weapons. Gun crews practiced together until they could perform barrel changes and clear malfunctions by feeling darkness or obscured visibility. This level of training required time and ammunition, both of which American forces had in abundance. German forces, by contrast, increasingly struggled to provide adequate training for replacement troops as the war progressed. German soldiers arriving at frontline units in 1944 and 1945 often had minimal weapons training and had to learn combat skills on the job. The disparity in training quality between American and German troops widened steadily as the war continued, with the M2 being one weapon where this training difference was particularly apparent. An inadequately trained M2 crew could still put rounds downrange and suppress enemy positions, but a well-trained crew could achieve precision effects at extreme ranges and maintain sustained fire for extended periods. The standard of training that American M2 crews achieved was simply beyond what German forces could replicate given their deteriorating strategic situation. The cultural impact of the M2 in post-war America and Germany took different forms but was significant in both cases. In America, the M2 became an icon of military power and industrial excellence, representing the arsenal of democracy that had helped win the war. Veterans returning from Europe brought with them stories of the M2's effectiveness, and the weapon featured prominently in movies, books, and other media about World War II. This cultural celebration of the M2 reinforced American confidence in their military capabilities and helped establish the narrative that American victory had been achieved through superior technology and industrial might rather than simply numerical superiority. In Germany, the M2 became part of the collective memory of defeat, a symbol of the overwhelming Allied material advantage that had crushed German resistance. German veterans' accounts that mentioned the M2 typically did so in the context of explaining how outgunned and outmatched German forces had been, providing a narrative that emphasized German soldiers had fought bravely against impossible odds rather than being defeated through military incompetence. This narrative served various purposes in post-war German society, helping to rehabilitate the reputation of the Wehrmacht while acknowledging the reality of German defeat. The technical innovation that occurred in American small arms development during and immediately after World War II was partly driven by the success of weapons like the M2. American weapons designers had demonstrated that reliability and practical effectiveness were more important than achieving maximum theoretical performance, and this principle influenced subsequent American weapons development. The M60 machine gun, developed in the 1950s as a replacement for various World War II-era weapons, incorporated lessons learned from M2 employment about the importance of quick barrel changes and robust operation under field conditions. The M14 and M16 rifles, while very different weapons designed for different roles, both reflected American emphasis on reliability and ease of manufacture. The legacy of the M2's design philosophy extended beyond any single weapon to influence an entire generation of American military equipment. German weapons designers in the post-war period, many of whom were recruited to work on American or NATO weapons programs, brought their own expertise in precision manufacturing and sophisticated mechanisms. The synthesis of German precision engineering and American emphasis on practical reliability helped create some of the most successful military weapons of the Cold War era. The story of the M2. 50 caliber machine gun and why German forces feared it so intensely is ultimately a story about the intersection of superior design, industrial capacity, and tactical doctrine. John Browning created a weapon that was fundamentally sound in its basic conception, requiring only minor refinements to achieve excellence. American industry transformed that design into hundreds of thousands of actual weapons that could be distributed throughout the force structure. American tactical doctrine employed those weapons in ways that maximized their effectiveness and created synergies with other arms. German forces, facing this combination of factors, found themselves consistently outmatched in firepower, despite often possessing comparable or superior individual soldier quality and tactical acumen. The M2 became the symbol of this imbalance, the weapon that German soldiers learned to fear and that represented everything they could not match about American military capabilities. From the deserts of North Africa to the hedgerows of Normandy, from the forests of the Ardennes to the streets of German cities, the distinctive sound of the M2 announced American presence and German vulnerability. It was a weapon that changed the course of battles and influenced the outcome of campaigns, all while maintaining the reliability and effectiveness that has kept it in service for over a century. The dark reason Germans hated the American M250 caliber was simple. It was devastatingly effective, it was everywhere, and there was nothing they could do to counter it. That weapon, more than almost any other, helped write the story of Allied victory and German defeat in World War II. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this deep dive into the M250 caliber machine gun and its impact on World War II informative and engaging. The M2 story is one of engineering excellence, industrial might, and tactical innovation that combine to create one of history's most effective and enduring weapons. If you enjoyed learning about this topic, make sure to check out our other videos about World War II weapons and the soldiers who faced them in combat. We have fascinating content about everything from tank battles to infantry tactics, from air combat to naval warfare. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. Your support helps us continue bringing you these detailed historical explorations. See you in the next one.